Welcome to Ask and Learn.
In this problem, we are given a chart and we need to fill in the missing information. We are given the signs, meaning positive, negative, or zero, for delta S, delta H, and delta G of a certain reaction. And we also are leaving a comment as to whether or not this reaction is spontaneous. So we're going to use these two relationships to help us fill in the missing information. Delta G equals delta H minus T delta S. That equation will help us determine the signs of the variables that we don't know given the ones that we do know. And the fact that positive values for delta G correspond to non-spontaneous reactions and that negative values correspond to spontaneous reactions will help us fill in the comments given the sign of delta G. So we start with part A, and we are told that we have a positive value for the change in entropy, delta S, and negative values for the change in enthalpy, delta H, and change in Gibbs free energy, delta G. So we have a positive value for delta S, a negative value for change in Gibbs free energy, and a negative value for delta H. But we see that for negative values of delta G, the reaction is spontaneous. And we are missing the comment in part A, so we know that this reaction is spontaneous because there is a negative value for delta G. Moving on to part B, we see that delta G is negative and delta H is 0. We want to determine what the sign of delta S is. So delta H is 0, so we can get rid of that term. And again, we are told that delta G is negative. Temperature is in units of Kelvin, or absolute temperature, so it's always going to be a positive value. But this negative sign out in front of the term T times delta S means that if the sign of delta S is positive, then when we multiply T and delta S, we get a positive value. But with that negative sign in front, that corresponds to a negative value. And that would make sense in order for us to have a negative value for delta G. So that's why for part B, given the information that we do know, the sign for delta S has to be positive. So we can fill that in. For part C, we are missing the sign for delta G. And if we notice in the comments, we are told that this is non-spontaneous. And remember that non-spontaneous reactions have positive values for the change in Gibbs free energy, delta G. And so just from the fact that it's non-spontaneous, we can conclude that that means there is a positive sign for delta G. In part D, we are told that delta S is 0 and delta G is negative. So delta S is 0, which means T delta S is 0. And delta G is negative. Since we got rid of the T times delta S term, the only way that delta G could be negative is if delta H is negative, because delta G equals delta H, since delta S is 0. So therefore, we can conclude that in part D, the sign for delta H must be negative. In part E, we are told that delta H is 0 and delta G is positive. So delta H is 0, delta G is positive. Temperature is always positive since it's measured in units of Kelvin. And since we are subtracting T times delta S must be negative, because when these two are multiplied together, a positive and a negative value results in a negative value, and we are subtracting a negative value, which really means that we are adding a positive value. Since delta H is 0, the only way for delta G to be positive is if delta S is negative. And so that is why for part E, the answer is that delta S must be negative. And also in part E, we are missing the comment as to whether or not this reaction is spontaneous. You see, we have a positive value for delta G, which corresponds to a non-spontaneous reaction. So the other answer for part E is not spontaneous. And finally, for part F, we are told that the product of T times delta S is greater than delta H, and we want to determine what the sign of delta G is. So we're told that this quantity is greater than delta H. So we could plug in qualitative numbers here to see this. Say that delta H is 5 minus this term T delta S, which is greater. Say that it's 10. 10 is greater than 5. That comes out to negative 5. Because T delta S is a greater term and we are subtracting that greater term from a smaller term, that means that delta G has to be negative. And that is the answer for part F.